She spent 2 hours on a turbulent flight calling the most dangerous mafia boss in America a soulless predator, a bloodthirsty tyrant, and a monster hiding behind expensive suits. She gripped his arm through every violent drop of the plane, screaming insults about the very man sitting inches from her face. She had no idea. And 3 days later, when he walked into her office as her new boss, he remembered every single word. If you want to find out what happens when a woman's worst nightmare turns out to be the love of her life, stay with this story until the very end. Hit that like button and drop the name of the city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. The rain came down in sheets so thick, Vivian Mercer could barely see 3 feet in front of her face. O'Hare International Airport was a zoo. Every flight delayed or canceled, every terminal packed with bodies, every gate agent looking like they wanted to crawl under the counter and disappear. The massive departure boards flickered with red cancellation notices like a scoreboard counting losses. Somewhere above the fluorescent-lit chaos, thunder cracked so hard the floor vibrated through Vivian's heels. She was already late. Not fashionably late, not casually late. The kind of late where you were running full speed through a crowded terminal with your laptop bag slamming against your hip, your blouse coming untucked from your skirt, and sweat gathering between your shoulder blades despite the aggressive air conditioning. Flight 728 to New York. Final boarding. The words burned across the departure screen, and Vivian's stomach dropped harder than any turbulence could manage. She cut through a group of tourists blocking the walkway, nearly knocked a coffee out of a businessman's hand, and hit gate 42 at a dead sprint. The gate agent was already reaching for the door. "Wait!" Vivian gasped, shoving her boarding pass forward. "Please!" The woman looked at her like she was personally offended by Vivian's existence, scanned the pass, glanced at the clock, then waved her through with the enthusiasm of someone directing traffic in a parking lot. Vivian didn't care. She was on the plane. That was all that mattered. She hated flying. Not in the casual way people said they hated Mondays or traffic or cold coffee. Vivian Mercer hated flying the way some people hated spiders, with a bone-deep, irrational, sweat-inducing terror that no amount of logic could fix. She knew the statistics. She knew driving was more dangerous. She knew all the reassuring facts about modern aviation safety that her therapist had printed on a laminated card she kept in her wallet, like some kind of anti-anxiety fortune cookie. None of it mattered when the cabin door sealed shut and the engines roared to life. She found her seat. 4A business class. A reckless purchase she'd made at 2 in the morning after her 3rd glass of wine and a brutal day at work. The kind of decision that felt empowering at midnight and financially devastating at 6 a.m. But the ticket was non-refundable, and Vivian told herself she deserved something after the month she'd survived. Her best friend Grace was getting married in Manhattan in 48 hours. Vivian was the maid of honor. Missing it was not an option, not after the year Grace had pulled her through. The late-night phone calls, the emergency ice cream deliveries. The time Grace had driven 4 hours in a snowstorm because Vivian texted, "I think I'm losing it," and Grace decided texting back wasn't good enough. So Vivian would get on this plane. She would survive this flight. She would stand next to her best friend and hold her bouquet and cry during the vows and pretend the last 12 months of professional hell hadn't nearly broken her. She shoved her bag into the overhead compartment, or tried to. The thing jammed sideways and refused to cooperate, which was basically a metaphor for Vivian's entire life at this point. She wrestled with it, one arm raised, her blouse pulling further out of her waistband, completely aware that she looked like a disaster. Then a hand reached past her, large, steady, the sleeve of an immaculate black suit jacket brushing past her shoulder. The bag slid into place like it weighed nothing. Vivian turned and looked directly into the face of the most unsettling man she'd ever seen. Tall, broad through the shoulders in a way that made the business class seat look like it was built for a child. Dark hair pushed back from a face that was all sharp angles. High cheekbones, a jaw that could cut glass, stubble shadowing his chin like he'd decided shaving was beneath him. His eyes were nearly black, calm and watchful, in a way that reminded Vivian of footage she'd seen of big cats right before they moved. Not aggressive, not threatening, just absolutely certain that nothing in this cabin could touch him. "Careful," he said. His voice was low and controlled, almost lazy. "You look like you're about to pass out." "I'm fine," Vivian lied, dropping into her seat and immediately reaching for her seatbelt with shaking hands. "You're not fine, your hands are shaking." It's cold in here. It's 72 degrees. She finally got the seatbelt latched and looked at him. He'd settled into the seat beside her like he owned the plane, legs crossed casually, one hand resting on the armrest between them. No nervous energy, no fidgeting. He existed in his body the way most people only managed after 3 drinks, completely, effortlessly still. "I'm Dante," he said. She didn't know why she answered honestly. Maybe because the plane was already taxiing and her anxiety was spiking and she needed to focus on something, anything, other than the 30,000-foot death trap she'd voluntarily entered. "Vivian? First time flying, Vivian?" "No, I fly. I just hate it." He studied her for a moment, not the way men usually looked at her, not with that up-and-down evaluation she'd learned to recognize and ignore. He looked at her the way someone examined a lock they were trying to pick, interested, patient, like he had all the time in the world to figure out what made her work. "Most fears have nothing to do with the thing itself," he said casually. "It's the loss of control. You can't do anything up here, can't steer, can't stop, can't leave." That's a really comforting thing to say to someone who's terrified of flying. The corner of his mouth lifted, not quite a smile, more like the ghost of one. "I'm not trying to comfort you. I'm telling you the truth." The plane accelerated down the runway. The engines roared. Vivian's fingers wrapped around both armrests so tightly her knuckles went white. She pressed her head back against the seat and closed her eyes, counting backwards from 10 the way her therapist had taught her. Except her brain kept skipping numbers and inserting images of fiery crashes she'd seen on the news. The wheels left the ground. Her stomach dropped. And then they were climbing, pushing through the storm, and the cabin shook like something was trying to tear it apart from the outside. Vivian lasted approximately 90 seconds before she grabbed the stranger's arm. She didn't mean to. It was pure reflex. The same instinct that made people reach for the nearest solid object when the ground disappeared beneath them. Her fingers clamped around his forearm like a vice, and she felt the hard muscle beneath his sleeve tense for just a moment before relaxing. He didn't pull away. He didn't say anything. He just let her hold on. The plane leveled out eventually, though the turbulence didn't stop. It came in waves, skiing, a few minutes of relative calm followed by sudden drops that sent Vivian's heart into her throat and her nails deeper into the stranger's arm. "Sorry," she muttered, not letting go. "I'm not usually this. I don't usually grab strangers." "You're fine." "I'm really not. Tell me about something else." His voice was steady, an anchor. "What are you flying to New York for?" "My best friend's wedding." "And what do you do when you're not white-knuckling your way through commercial aviation?" Despite everything, Vivian almost laughed. "I work in marketing, Blackthorn Media Group. Do you know it?" Something shifted behind his eyes. So brief she almost missed it. A flicker. Not surprise exactly, but recognition. Like she'd said something he hadn't expected but found interesting. "I've heard the name," he said carefully. "Well, congratulations, because it's about to cease to exist." "Why?" The plane dropped again. Hard. Vivian gasped and tightened her grip on his arm. When she spoke, the words came tumbling out in a rush, the way they always did when she was scared, because Vivian Mercer had exactly 2 responses to terror: silence or verbal avalanche. Tonight, it was avalanche. "Because some criminal bought the company," she said. "Some mafia boss who decided he wanted a legitimate business to hide behind. You know the type. Guys who build their empires on fear and violence and then buy up real companies so they can pretend they're businessmen." "Interesting." "It's not interesting. It's terrifying. I've spent 6 years building campaigns for that company. 6 years. And now some mobster is going to walk in and destroy everything we built because he needs a place to launder his blood money." The stranger's expression didn't change. Calm, attentive, like she was reading him the weather forecast instead of ranting about organized crime. "You know his name?" he asked. "Roman Castellano." She said it like a curse. "Have you heard of him?" "Once or twice." "Then you know what he is. A predator. A soulless predator who crushes people for sport and hides behind expensive suits and private security. The man has a body count, Dante. An actual body count. And now he's going to sit in our conference room and pretend he cares about quarterly revenue while his thugs intimidate everyone into silence." The plane lurched sideways. Vivian yelped and pressed her shoulder into the stranger's arm. "God, I hate this," she hissed. "The flying or the mafia boss?" "Both." What would you say to him if you could? Vivian looked at the man beside her. His dark eyes were locked on hers with an intensity she couldn't quite read. Amused? Maybe. Curious? Definitely. But something else, too. Something deeper. Like she'd said something that mattered to him in a way she couldn't understand. I tell him that money doesn't make you powerful, she said. Fear doesn't make you powerful. Power is what you build when nobody's afraid to tell you the truth. And men like Roman Castellano will never know what that feels like because everyone around them is too terrified to be honest. Silence. The stranger studied her for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "That might be the most dangerous thing you've ever said." Vivian frowned. Why? He didn't answer. Instead, he reached for the flight attendant button and ordered 2 whiskeys without asking if she wanted one. When the drinks arrived, he handed her one. "For the turbulence," he said. Vivian took it. She didn't normally drink with strangers on airplanes, but nothing about this night was normal, and the whiskey burned through her chest in a way that felt more stabilizing than any breathing exercise. They talked for 2 hours. Not small talk. Not the polite, surface-level conversation people made on planes to fill silence. Real conversation. About power and fear and ambition and the things people did when they were desperate. Vivian told him about growing up broke in Southside Chicago, about her mother working double shifts at a laundromat, about putting herself through college on scholarships and stubborn refusal to fail. She told him about the mentor who'd given her a shot at Blackthorn and the campaigns she'd built from nothing. She told him about her fear that everything she'd worked for was about to disappear because one powerful man decided her company was a useful asset. And the stranger, Dante, listened. Not the way most people listened, which was really just waiting for their turn to talk. He listened like he was cataloging every word, filing it, storing it, turning each sentence over in his mind like a jeweler examining stones. He asked questions that cut deeper than they should have. What scares you more? Why, losing the job or losing the identity that comes with it? What would you build if money didn't matter? Do you think people can change what they are or only what they do? Vivian answered every question honestly, partly because the whiskey had loosened her tongue, and partly because something about this man made her feel like lying was pointless. Not because he'd catch her, though she suspected he would, but because his honesty demanded hers. He told her very little about himself. He was in business. He traveled frequently. He'd grown up in Chicago but spent years in Italy. He liked jazz and old architecture, and had a sister who called him every Sunday whether he answered or not. When Vivian asked what kind of business, he smiled. The complicated kind. When she pressed, he said, the kind that makes people uncomfortable. When she pressed harder, he said, you should stop asking questions you might not want the answers to. So she stopped. The plane landed at JFK at 11:47 p.m. The storm had followed them across 3 states, and the runway was slicked with rain, and when the wheels touched asphalt, Vivian released a breath she felt like she'd been holding since Chicago. She let go of his arm, finally. "Thank you," she said, genuinely embarrassed. "For letting me, for the arm thing, and for listening to me rant about the Mafia." Dante stood and pulled her bag from the overhead compartment, handed it to her. Their fingers brushed, and Vivian felt something electric pass between them, brief and sharp, like static shock, but warmer. "It was an interesting flight," he said. "That's one word for it." He looked at her for a moment longer than necessary. Something complicated moved behind his eyes, something that looked almost like regret. "Be careful, Vivian Mercer," he said. Then he walked off the plane ahead of her and disappeared into the terminal crowd. Vivian stood in the jetway for a moment, her heart still racing. Though she couldn't tell anymore whether it was from the turbulence or from him, the wedding was beautiful. Grace looked stunning. The ceremony made Vivian cry twice. The reception went until 3 a.m., and Vivian danced until her feet ached and drank champagne until her cheeks hurt from smiling. For 2 days, she forgot about Blackthorn media and criminal empires and the soulless predator waiting back in Chicago. She forgot about Dante, too. Mostly. Sometimes, late at night in her Manhattan hotel room, she'd catch herself thinking about his voice. The way he'd said, "That might be the most dangerous thing you've ever said." The way his arm hadn't moved once during the entire flight while she clung to him like a drowning woman. But he was a stranger on a plane. A beautiful, unsettling stranger who'd bought her whiskey and let her use him as an anxiety anchor. That was all. She flew back to Chicago on Monday morning. The flight was smooth. She barely noticed. Tuesday dawned gray and cold, the kind of Chicago morning that felt like the city was punishing you for existing. Vivian arrived at Blackthorn Media at 8:15, carrying a coffee she'd already half finished and wearing the blazer she saved for days when she needed armor. The lobby felt different. Not physically. The marble floors and glass walls and modern art installations were exactly the same. But the energy had shifted. People walked faster, spoke quieter. The usual morning chatter, gossip, complaints, whose turn it was to refill the printer, had been replaced by tight-lipped silence and darting eyes. Vivian stepped into the elevator with Marcus Chen, Blackthorn's head of digital strategy, and one of the few people in the office she actually trusted. "What happened?" she asked immediately. Marcus stared straight ahead. His jaw was tight. "Emergency all-hands meeting, 9th floor, 10 o'clock. "About what?" "About the new owner." Vivian's stomach clenched. "He's here?" "He's here." The elevator opened. Marcus walked out without another word. Vivian spent the next 90 minutes trying to focus on work and failing completely. She sat at her desk, staring at a campaign brief she'd written last week, reading the same paragraph 4 times without absorbing a single word. Around her, the marketing department was a pressure cooker. People huddled in corners, speaking in whispers. Someone in accounting had already packed a box. At 9:55, Vivian walked into the 9th floor conference room. It was packed. Every department head, every senior manager, every executive who hadn't already resigned in the past 2 weeks. The long glass table was surrounded by expensive chairs, and every single person sitting in them looked like they were attending their own funeral. Vivian found a seat near the back, next to a junior copywriter named Beth, who was chewing her thumbnail down to the quick. "Have you seen him?" Beth whispered. "No." "I heard he's terrifying, like genuinely terrifying." "He's a businessman," Vivian said, though the word felt hollow even as she spoke it. "He's a mafia boss," Beth corrected. "There's a difference." At exactly 10 o'clock, the conference room doors opened, and Vivian's world ended. Not loudly, not dramatically. It ended the way ice cracks, silently, invisibly, and completely. 2 men entered first. Large, stone-faced, the kind of men who communicated exclusively through controlled violence. They wore identical black suits and positioned themselves on either side of the doorway with the practiced efficiency of people who'd done this 1,000 times. Then more security entered, 4 of them, taking positions along the walls with earpieces and cold eyes. Then silence. The kind of silence that happens when every person in a room simultaneously stops breathing. And then he walked in. Roman Castellano, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a suit so perfectly tailored it looked like it had been sewn directly onto his body. Dark hair pushed back, jaw shadowed with stubble, eyes nearly black carrying that same impossible calm that had... Vivian stopped breathing. Her coffee slipped in her grip. She caught it, barely, but some sloshed over the rim and burned her fingers, and she didn't feel it because every nerve in her body had redirected to a single, devastating realization. Dante, the man from the plane, the stranger who'd listened to her rant for 2 hours about what a soulless monster Roman Castellano was. The man whose arm she'd gripped through every drop of turbulence while she called his name like a curse. He was Roman Castellano. Roman's dark eyes swept the room slowly, the way a general surveyed a conquered territory. Every person he looked at seemed to shrink slightly. Spines straightened, shoulders tightened, hands disappeared beneath the table. Then his gaze found Vivian and stopped. A slow, devastating smile touched his mouth. Not warm, not cruel. Something in between. Something that said he'd been waiting for this exact moment since the wheels touched down at JFK. "Good morning," Roman said, addressing the entire room, but never taking his eyes off Vivian. "My name is Roman Castellano. I'm the new owner of Blackthorn Media Group. I look forward to working with all of you." His voice was the same, low, controlled. That dangerous calm she'd mistaken for confidence on the plane, but now recognized for what it actually was. Power. Absolute, untouchable, lethal power. He spoke for 20 minutes about his vision for the company, about restructuring, about streamlined operations and market expansion and all the corporate language that really meant, I own you now and everything changes. Vivian heard almost none of it. She was too busy calculating how quickly she could resign, leave the building, change her name, and move to another continent. When the meeting ended, people stood slowly, carefully, the way you moved around sleeping predators. They filed toward the door in silence, and Vivian stood with them, already planning her escape route. Miss Mercer. His voice cut through the shuffling bodies like a blade. Every head turned toward her. Stay after, please, Roman continued smoothly. I'd like to discuss your hotel campaign personally. Vivian felt 60 pairs of eyes land on her simultaneously. Curious eyes, nervous eyes, eyes that said, better you than me. Beth touched her elbow on the way out. I'll say something nice at your funeral, she whispered. Then the room emptied. And Vivian Mercer was alone with the most dangerous man in Chicago. The silence was suffocating. Roman stood near the windows overlooking the city, his back to her, hands in his pockets. The gray morning light cut sharp lines across his profile, the same profile she'd studied on the plane while pretending not to stare. Close the door, he said without turning. Vivian's heart hammered against her ribs. Her legs felt numb, but she walked to the door and closed it because some part of her, the stupid, stubborn, South Side part that had survived everything else, refused to let this man see her run. She turned back to face him. Roman was watching her now. That same look from the plane, patient, amused, like she was the most interesting problem he'd encountered in years. You look like you're going to be sick, he observed. I might be. The trash can's by the door if you need it. Vivian swallowed hard. Her throat felt like sandpaper. You lied to me. I told you my name was Dante. That's my middle name. That's not the same as telling the truth. No, he agreed. It's not. He moved away from the window and sat on the edge of the conference table. Casual, like this was a conversation between old friends instead of a hostage negotiation. You called me a soulless predator, he said. I didn't know who you were. A bloodthirsty tyrant. I was scared. The turbulence. A monster hiding behind expensive suits. Vivian closed her eyes. Are you going to fire me? Should I? Probably. Why? Because I said terrible things about the man who signs my paycheck while literally holding onto his arm for dear life. That feels like a fireable offense. Roman laughed. It was soft, genuine, and completely disarming. Not the cold, calculated sound she'd expected from a mafia boss. It was the laugh of a man who'd heard something so absurd, it broke through whatever wall he normally kept in place. Vivian, he said, and the way he used her name, without permission, without formality, like he'd already decided they were past that, sent something dangerous through her chest. I've had men twice your size stammer through carefully rehearsed compliments because they were terrified of saying the wrong thing. I've had executives hand me presentations they spent weeks perfecting, and every single one of them was designed to tell me exactly what they thought I wanted to hear. He leaned forward slightly. You spent 2 hours telling me what nobody else in this city has the spine to say. Why would I fire you for that? Vivian stared at him. Because most powerful men don't enjoy being insulted. Most powerful men are too fragile to recognize honesty when they hear it. The silence stretched between them like a wire pulled taut. Your hotel campaign, Roman said, shifting the conversation so smoothly it took Vivian a moment to adjust. The Meridian account. I read the pitch deck on the flight back from New York. You read my pitch deck? I read everything. Every campaign Blackthorn has active. Every account. Every proposal. He paused. Yours was the only one that didn't bore me. Vivian didn't know how to respond to that. Flattery from a mafia boss felt like a trap, like a compliment wrapped around a knife. I want you to lead the Meridian campaign directly, he continued. Full authority, expanded budget, no committee approvals. Why? Because it's good work, and I don't believe in suffocating good work with bureaucracy. And because I called you a monster to your face and lived to tell about it? That almost smile again. The one she'd seen on the plane. That's just a bonus. Vivian stood there, in the empty conference room, looking at the man who controlled a criminal empire and a billion-dollar media company, and probably a few politicians she didn't want to think about, and she made a decision. She could run, resign, walk out the door, and never come back, Or she could stay, take the opportunity, prove that the work she'd spent 6 years building was worth more than the fear this man inspired. "Fine," she said. "I'll lead the Meridian campaign." "Good, but I have conditions." Something flickered in Roman's eyes. Not anger, surprise. Like a chess opponent had made a move he hadn't anticipated. "Conditions," he repeated. "I report directly to you on this campaign. No intermediaries, no handlers, and no interference from whatever other operations you might be running through this company." "You're negotiating with me." "Yes." "People don't negotiate with me, Vivian." "Then maybe they should." The silence that followed was the longest 10 seconds of Vivian's life. She could hear her own pulse, could feel sweat gathering at the base of her spine, could see Roman Castellanos studying her with those dark, unreadable eyes, like he was deciding something fundamental about whether she lived or died. Then he stood, extended his hand. "Deal." Vivian shook it. His grip was firm and warm and held for exactly 1 second longer than necessary. "Welcome to the new Blackthorn," he said. Then he walked past her toward the door, and she caught his cologne, something dark and expensive that she recognized from the plane, and her stomach did something complicated that had nothing to do with fear. He paused at the door. "Vivian?" She turned. "For what it's worth," he said, "you were right about one thing." "What?" "Power is what you build when nobody's afraid to tell you the truth." His eyes held hers. "That's why I need you to keep being honest with me, even when it terrifies you." Then he was gone. And Vivian stood alone in the empty conference room, hands shaking, heart racing, with the terrible understanding that the most dangerous man in Chicago had just looked at her like she was the most important person in the room, and the even more terrible understanding that some part of her, some reckless, self-destructive, completely irrational part, had liked it. Over the next 3 weeks, Vivian threw herself into the Meridian campaign with the kind of desperate intensity that people either admired or diagnosed. She worked 16-hour days. She redesigned the entire pitch from scratch. She fought with the creative team, charmed the account executives, and produced preliminary results that made even the skeptics admit she might actually be brilliant. And Roman was everywhere. Not hovering, not micromanaging, but present in a way that was impossible to ignore. He appeared at her office door with coffee at 9 p.m. when the rest of the floor was dark. He sat in on her creative meetings and asked questions so sharp they exposed weaknesses she hadn't seen. He read every draft she sent him and returned notes that were blunt, occasionally harsh, and always infuriatingly correct. "Your third quarter projections are optimistic," he told her one evening, standing in her office doorway with his sleeves rolled up and his tie loosened, looking nothing like a man who'd reportedly ordered someone's kneecaps broken that morning. "They're ambitious," Vivian corrected. "They're the same thing when you don't have the data to back them up." "I have instincts." "Instincts are what people cite when their spreadsheets don't support their arguments." "Fine. I'll redo the numbers." "You'll redo them because they need redoing, not because I told you to." Vivian looked at him. "Is there a difference?" "If you can't tell the difference, we have a bigger problem." It infuriated her. All of it. The way he challenged everything she said. The way he was almost always right. The way he made her better without ever once saying good job or well done or any of the soft encouragements normal managers offered. Roman Castellano didn't manage. He demanded. And somehow, impossibly, that made Vivian want to exceed every expectation he set. Which was exactly the problem. Because somewhere between the late-night coffee deliveries and the razor-sharp critiques and the moments when his hand brushed her shoulder as he leaned over her desk to point at something on her screen, somewhere in the middle of all that, Vivian stopped seeing a mafia boss. She started seeing a man. A brilliant, complicated, deeply guarded man who built an empire through fear because he didn't know how to build one through trust. A man who read her campaign proposals at midnight and remembered every detail. A man who, according to Marcus, had personally funded the college education of every child in his household staff's families, quietly, without publicity, without anyone ever knowing. A man who frightened everyone in the building except her. And that terrified Vivian more than any turbulence ever could. Because falling for a mafia boss wasn't just reckless, it was a death sentence. And she was already halfway down. Then Celeste Vaughn happened. Celeste was Blackthorn's Senior Vice President of Client Relations, a title that meant nothing and a woman who meant trouble. She was tall, blonde, surgically precise in appearance and conversation, and she'd been at the company long enough to know where every body was buried, both literally and figuratively. She cornered Vivian in the restroom on a Thursday afternoon. "You're spending a lot of time with him," Celeste said, reapplying lipstick without looking away from the mirror. "With who?" Celeste's eyes met hers in the reflection, cold, evaluating. "Don't play stupid, Vivian. It doesn't suit you." "He's reviewing my campaign, that's all." Roman Castellano doesn't review campaigns. He destroys companies and rebuilds them in his image. The fact that he's reviewing yours means something very specific. "It means the campaign is good." Celeste turned to face her. Up close, her smile was a weapon, sharp and precisely aimed. "It means he wants something from you. And when Roman Castellano wants something, people who get in the way tend to disappear." She leaned closer. "Be very careful, sweetheart. This is not your world, and the people in it don't play by your rules." Then she walked out, and Vivian stood alone in the bathroom, staring at her own reflection, and saw what Celeste saw: a woman in over her head, a woman being pulled into an orbit she couldn't escape, a woman who was starting to feel things for a man who could destroy her with a phone call. And the worst part? She couldn't tell if the shaking in her hands was from fear or from wanting him to walk through her door again. That Friday night, Roman called her into his office at 7 p.m. The building was nearly empty. The city had gone dark outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, and the only light came from the desk lamp casting warm shadows across his face. He was standing when she entered, not sitting behind his desk, standing in the middle of the room like he'd been pacing, which was something Vivian had never seen him do. "Close the door," he said. The same words, the same voice, but something was different tonight. There was tension in his shoulders that she hadn't seen before, a tightness around his jaw. Like whatever control he usually maintained was costing him more than usual. Vivian closed the door. "What's wrong?" Roman looked at her for a long moment. Then he walked to the bar cart in the corner and poured 2 glasses of whiskey, handed her one. "I received a report today," he said, "about threats made against Blackthorn executives." "What kind of threats?" "The kind that come with photographs and addresses." Vivian's blood ran cold. "Who?" "Several people. Marcus Chen, the CFO, the head of legal." He paused. "You." The glass nearly slipped from her fingers. "Me? Why would anyone threaten me?" Roman's jaw tightened. "Because you've been seen with me. Because people in my world have noticed that I've been spending time with a specific employee. And in my world, that kind of attention makes you a target." "A target for what?" "For leverage." The word hung in the air between them like smoke. "Rival families," Roman continued quietly. "People who want to hurt me. They can't touch me directly. I'm too protected. So they look for weaknesses, people I care about, He stopped himself. The silence that followed was deafening. "People you what?" Vivian whispered. Roman set his glass down. He turned to face her fully, and for the first time since she'd met him, the mask slipped. Not completely, not dramatically, but enough for her to see what was underneath, and what was underneath terrified her more than anything on that plane ever had. Because Roman Castellano was looking at her like she was the only real thing in a world built entirely on lies. "I should transfer you," he said quietly. "Move you to another division. Put distance between us. That's what any rational person would do." And I'm finding it increasingly difficult to be rational when it comes to you." Vivian's heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her temples, in her wrists, in the tips of her fingers gripping the whiskey glass. "Roman, don't." His voice was rough, raw. "Don't say whatever you're about to say, because if you tell me to keep my distance, I will. And if you tell me not to—" He exhaled sharply. "I don't think I can guarantee your safety if I don't." The room felt smaller, the air felt thinner. Every survival instinct Vivian possessed was screaming at her to walk out that door and never look back. Instead, she set her glass down and stepped closer. "I didn't survive growing up broke on the South Side," she said quietly, "by letting other people make my choices for me." Roman's eyes darkened. "This isn't a marketing campaign, Vivian. This is my life. People die in my life. Then I guess you'd better make sure I don't. The distance between them shrank to inches. She could smell his cologne, could feel the heat radiating off his body, could see the pulse jumping in his neck. The only indication that the most controlled man she'd ever met was coming apart at the seams. He raised his hand slowly, touched her jaw. His fingers were warm and rough and trembling, barely, almost imperceptibly, but trembling. "You're going to be the death of me," he murmured. "Or the making of you," she whispered back. His thumb traced her lower lip, and the building's fire alarm exploded through the silence like a gunshot. They jerked apart. Roman's hand went immediately to his waist, to a weapon Vivian suddenly realized he was carrying, and his entire body transformed in an instant from the man touching her face to the mafia boss who controlled an empire. "Stay behind me," he ordered, already moving toward the door. "What's happening?" "Stay behind me." His security materialized from nowhere. Two men flanking the door, another speaking rapidly into an earpiece. Roman exchanged words with them in Italian, sharp and fast, his expression pure ice. Then he turned to Vivian. "It's not a fire. Someone triggered the alarm deliberately." "Why?" His jaw clenched. "Because someone wanted to know exactly where I was in this building tonight, and exactly who I was with." Vivian felt the blood drain from her face. Roman stepped closer. His hand gripped her arm. Not gentle, not rough, just certain. "I'm going to get you out of here safely," he said, "but after tonight, everything changes." "What do you mean?" His dark eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that burned. "I mean, they know about you now, Vivian, and the people who know about you are not the kind of people who forget." He pulled her toward the service elevator, flanked by armed men, and as the doors closed around them, Vivian caught her own reflection in the polished steel. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had just stepped into a world she couldn't escape. And the terrifying part wasn't the danger. It was that even now, surrounded by armed guards, being rushed through a building that might be compromised, standing next to a man whose enemies had just sent a message, even now, the thing she felt most intensely wasn't fear. It was the ghost of his fingers on her jaw, and the devastating certainty that wherever Roman Castellano was taking her, she was going to follow. The service elevator dropped 17 floors in silence. Vivian counted each one by the faint digital numbers flickering above the steel doors. 17. 16. 15. Her reflection stared back at her from the polished metal, pale face, wide eyes, lipstick bitten off hours ago. Roman stood inches to her left, close enough that she could feel the heat from his body but not touching her. His hand rested near his waist where the weapon sat hidden beneath his jacket, and his jaw was locked so tight she could see the muscle jumping beneath the stubble. Two of his men flanked them. The one on the left, thick-necked, shaved head, a scar running from his ear to his collar, spoke rapid Italian into an earpiece. The other stood perfectly still, watching the elevator doors like he expected something to come through them. Nobody spoke to Vivian. Nobody even looked at her. She was cargo now. Something to be moved, protected, delivered. The elevator opened into the parking garage beneath the building. 3 black SUVs idled in a row, headlights cutting through the concrete darkness. Roman's hand found the small of her back, firm, impersonal, guiding, and she was in the back seat of the middle vehicle before her brain caught up with her legs. Roman slid in beside her. The doors locked. The convoy moved. "Where are we going?" Vivian asked. "Somewhere safe." "That's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting right now." She looked at him. In the passing streetlights, his face shifted between shadow and amber light. The same face she'd studied on the plane, the same jaw, the same dark eyes. But the man from the plane was gone. The one sitting beside her now was something else entirely, coiled, focused, every ounce of charm stripped away, leaving nothing but the predator underneath. "How long have they been watching you?" Vivian asked. Roman didn't answer immediately. He was checking his phone, scrolling through messages in Italian, his thumb moving with calm precision. "Roman. Long enough to know your apartment address, your daily route to work, and the name of the coffee shop where you buy your morning latte." He didn't look up. "The alarm was a message. They wanted me to know they could reach inside my own building whenever they wanted." "Who?" "The Moretti family. They've been pushing at my territory for months, testing boundaries, looking for cracks." And I'm a crack? Now he looked at her, those dark eyes steady and unreadable. You're a crack I created by being careless. The words landed like a slap. Not because they were cruel, because they were honest. Roman Castellano didn't sugarcoat. He didn't soften. He handed you the truth like a loaded weapon and let you decide what to do with it. The convoy turned onto Lakeshore Drive. Rain streaked across the tinted windows. I'm taking you to my residence tonight, Roman said. It's the most secure location I have. Tomorrow morning, my team will sweep your apartment and install a security system. From this point forward, you'll have a detail assigned to you. A detail? 2 men. They'll be discreet. You're assigning me bodyguards. I'm assigning you protection. I didn't ask for protection. Roman's voice dropped lower, harder. And I didn't ask for someone to trigger the fire alarm in my own building to prove they could get to the woman sitting in my office. But here we are. Vivian fell silent. She watched the city blur past the window, the dark expanse of Lake Michigan, the towers of light rising from the Gold Coast, the familiar skyline that suddenly felt foreign, like she was seeing it through different eyes, through the eyes of someone who understood that behind every glittering building there were men like Roman making decisions that determined who lived and who didn't. They arrived at a high-rise on East Lake Shore Drive, the kind of building that didn't have a name on the outside because the people who lived there didn't need one. The lobby was marble and silence. The private elevator required a key card and a code. Roman entered both without speaking. His penthouse occupied the entire top floor. Vivian walked into a space that looked like it had been designed by someone who understood beauty but didn't trust it. Clean lines, dark furniture, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the black mirror of the lake. Everything was expensive and impersonal. No family photos, no clutter, no evidence that a human being lived here rather than just occupied it. Guest room is down the hall, Roman said, removing his jacket and draping it over a chair. Without it, she could see the shoulder holster clearly, dark leather straps against his white shirt, the matte black grip of the weapon tucked beneath his arm. He removed the holster with practiced ease and set it on the kitchen counter like it was a wallet or a set of keys. "Are you hungry?" he asked. "Are you serious? People still need to eat during crises." "I'm not hungry. You should eat anyway." "Roman, someone just sent you a message that they know where I live and you're asking me if I want a sandwich." He turned to face her, leaned against the kitchen island, crossed his arms, and for the first time since the alarm went off, something softened in his expression. Not much, just a fraction, like a crack in a dam that was still holding but barely. "I've been in this world since I was 17 years old," he said quietly. "I've survived things you can't imagine. Ambushes, betrayals, a car bomb that killed my driver and should have killed me. I survived all of it because I never let anyone close enough to be used against me." He paused. "And then you grabbed my arm on a plane and called me a monster, and I made the mistake of finding that interesting instead of irrelevant." Vivian's chest tightened. "So this is my fault?" "No, it's mine. I knew what I was doing when I kept showing up at your office, when I brought the coffee, when I read your proposals at midnight instead of delegating them to someone else. I knew exactly what was happening, and I let it happen because—" He stopped, ran a hand through his hair. It was the most human gesture she'd ever seen him make. "Because what?" "Because you make me forget what I am." The words hung in the air between them like smoke after gunfire. Vivian stood on the other side of the kitchen island, 12 feet of cold marble separating them, and felt something inside her chest crack open in a way that couldn't be repaired. "You should sleep," Roman said, his voice returning to that controlled register. "I have calls to make, security adjustments. My people will bring you clothes in the morning." "Roman." "Go to sleep, Vivian." She didn't move. "Thank you," she said, "for getting me out." He nodded once, then turned away, and Vivian walked down the hallway to the guest room feeling like she was leaving something unfinished, something that would either save them both or destroy them. She didn't sleep. She lay in a bed that probably cost more than 3 months of her rent, staring at a ceiling she couldn't see in the darkness, listening to the muffled sound of Roman's voice through the walls, speaking Italian. His tone shifting between cold authority and something that sounded almost like rage, controlled, compressed, the kind of anger that didn't explode but calculated. At 2 a.m., the voices stopped. At 2:15, she heard footsteps in the hallway. They paused outside her door, stayed there for what felt like a full minute, then moved on. Vivian pressed her hand against her own sternum and felt her heartbeat hammering beneath her palm. She was in a mafia boss's penthouse, guarded by armed men, targeted by a rival family. And the only thing keeping her safe was the most dangerous man in Chicago, a man who just admitted she made him forget what he was. Vivian stared at the ceiling until dawn cracked gray and cold through the curtains. Morning came without mercy. Vivian walked out of the guest room at 6:30, wearing the same clothes from the night before, her hair pulled back with a band she'd found in her purse, her makeup a smudged memory of yesterday's attempt at professionalism. Roman was already in the kitchen, dressed, shaved, wearing a fresh suit like the night before hadn't happened. 2 espressos sat on the counter, one in front of him, one positioned exactly where she'd need to stand. "Your apartment's been swept," he said without looking up from his phone. "Clean, no devices, no signs of forced entry, but I've installed a system, cameras on the building entrances, sensor on your door, panic button in your bedroom." "You put cameras on my building, on the entrances, not inside your apartment." How reassuring. He glanced up, almost smiled. Almost. "Your detail will meet you downstairs in 40 minutes. Marco and Enzo. They'll keep distance at work, but they'll be nearby." Vivian picked up the espresso, took a sip. It was perfect. Strong, bitter, no sugar. She didn't remember telling him how she took her coffee. "I need to go to work," she said. "I know. And I need people to not know I spent the night here. Nobody knows. Celeste will figure it out." Roman set his phone down. "What did Celeste say to you?" Vivian hesitated. Something about sharing the bathroom conversation felt like running to the teacher, petty and small. But Roman's eyes were fixed on her with that investigative intensity, and she understood that withholding information from this man wasn't just difficult, it was dangerous. "She warned me, said you wanted something from me, said people who get in your way disappear." Roman's expression didn't change, but something behind it shifted, cold and precise, like a scope adjusting. "When?" "Thursday, in the restroom." "What else?" "She said this wasn't my world, and the people in it don't play by my rules." Roman was quiet for a long moment. Then he picked up his phone and typed something, a single message, 3 seconds, and set it down again. "What did you just do?" Vivian asked. "Nothing you need to worry about." That's the kind of answer that makes me worry more. Celeste Vaughn has been with this company for 9 years. She knows how my world works because she's been adjacent to it longer than most. That makes her useful. It also makes her dangerous. Dangerous how? She's ambitious in a way that has no ceiling, and ambitious people without ceilings eventually decide the rules don't apply to them. You think she's involved in what happened last night? I don't think anything yet. I'm gathering information. That's a very diplomatic way of saying you're investigating her. I'm investigating everyone. The espresso cooled in Vivian's hands. She looked at this man, this impeccably dressed, terrifyingly calm, impossibly complicated man, and asked the question she'd been choking on since the elevator. "What are we doing, Roman?" He met her eyes. "What do you mean?" "You know exactly what I mean. Last night in your office, your hand on my face, the things you said. And now I'm standing in your kitchen wearing yesterday's clothes while your security team sweeps my apartment for surveillance devices. What are we doing?" Roman stood slowly. He walked around the island until he was standing in front of her, close enough that she had to tilt her chin up to maintain eye contact. "We're standing at the edge of something neither of us can take back," he said. "And I need you to understand what that means before we go any further. Tell me." "It means if I let this happen, if I let you in, you become part of my world. Not the version of it you see at Blackthorn, the real one, the one where people get hurt, where loyalty is tested with blood, where the woman standing next to me becomes the first target every enemy considers. And if I walk away, then you walk away. I reassign you to a different division. Your security detail stays for 6 months until the threat diminishes, and we pretend the last 3 weeks never happened. Can you do that? Pretend?" His jaw tightened. "I've done harder things." "That's not what I asked." The silence between them crackled. "No," he admitted. "I don't think I can." Vivian set her espresso down. She looked at Roman Castellano, the scars she could see on his knuckles, the ones she couldn't see that ran deeper, the exhaustion behind his eyes that no amount of tailoring could disguise. And she made a decision that she knew, with absolute certainty, would change the trajectory of her entire life. She reached up and straightened his tie. A small gesture, intimate, the kind of thing a woman did for a man she'd already decided was hers. Roman went completely still beneath her fingers. "I told you on the plane," she said quietly. "Power is what you build when nobody's afraid to tell you the truth." "I remember." "Then here's the truth." She met his eyes. "I'm terrified. I'm in over my head. I don't understand your world, and I'm not sure I ever will. But I didn't survive everything I've survived to run away from the first man who's ever made me feel like my honesty was worth something." Roman's hand came up and covered hers where it rested against his chest. She could feel his heartbeat through the fabric, steady, strong, faster than she expected. "They will come for you," he said. "Not might. Will. Then you'd better be as good at protecting people as you are at scaring them." Something broke behind his eyes. Not visibly. Roman Castellano didn't break where people could see, but she felt it through his hand. A tremor. A fracture in the foundation. He pulled her against him. Not gently, not roughly. With the exhausted certainty of a man who'd been holding something back for weeks and couldn't hold it anymore. His arms wrapped around her completely, and for a moment he just stood there, his chin resting against the top of her head, breathing. "You're going to be the death of me," he murmured. "You already said that. It bears repeating." He pulled back enough to look at her face. His thumb brushed her cheekbone, and then he kissed her. Not the desperate movie screen kiss she might have imagined, but something slower and more devastating. The kind of kiss that felt like a man laying down his weapons, one by one, and hoping he survived the surrender. When they finally separated, Vivian's hands were shaking. Roman's weren't, but his voice was rougher than she'd ever heard it when he spoke. "Go to work. Act normal. The Meridian presentation is Thursday. Focus on that." "And us?" "There is no us inside that building. Not yet. Not until I know who triggered that alarm and why." "And outside the building?" He looked at her with something that might have been tenderness if it wasn't wrapped in so much danger. "Outside the building, you're mine. And I protect what's mine with everything I have." Vivian nodded. She picked up her purse, walked toward the door. "Vivian," she turned, "the things you said about me on that plane. The monster. The predator." His dark eyes held hers across the room. "You weren't wrong about all of it." "I know. And you're still here." "I know that too." She walked out of the penthouse, into the elevator, through the marble lobby, and into a black SUV where two men she'd never met were waiting to follow her for the rest of her life. And standing at his kitchen counter, Roman Castellano watched her leave through the security feed on his phone. This woman who'd stormed into his existence on a turbulent flight and dismantled every wall he'd spent 30 years building, and felt something he hadn't felt since he was a boy watching his mother's coffin lowered into the ground. Fear. Not of enemies, not of rivals, not of the violence that had defined every year of his adult life. Fear of losing something he'd just barely allowed himself to want. He picked up his phone, dialed a number. The line answered on the first ring. "Find out who triggered the alarm," Roman said. "Every camera, every access log, every employee who entered or exited the building after 6 p.m. A pause on the other end. "And pull everything we have on Celeste Vaughn. Financial records, phone logs, travel history." Another pause. "All of it," Roman said coldly. "Because if she's the one who let them in..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The morning sun climbed over Lake Michigan, painting the penthouse in pale gold, and Roman Castellano stood alone in his fortress, staring at the point on his kitchen counter where Vivian's espresso cup still sat. And he knew, with the same cold certainty he'd used to build an empire, that this woman was going to cost him everything. The only question was whether he'd survive the price. 3 days later, the answer started becoming clear. Vivian's Meridian presentation killed. Standing in a boardroom full of executives who still flinched when Roman entered a room, she delivered 60 minutes of strategic brilliance that turned skeptics into believers and made even the stone-faced security men at the door pay attention. Roman watched from the back of the room, arms crossed, expression neutral, giving nothing away. But when Vivian finished and the room erupted in the nervous, enthusiastic applause of people who wanted their boss to see them supporting his favorite employee, Roman's eyes stayed on her. And in that brief, unguarded moment before he rebuilt the mask, Vivian saw something she'd never seen on his face during business hours. Pride. Not possessive pride. Not the smug satisfaction of a man admiring his acquisition. The quiet, fierce pride of someone watching a person they cared about prove they belonged exactly where they stood. Then the mask returned. Roman nodded once, said solid work like it was 2 words instead of a revelation, and walked out of the boardroom with his security trailing behind him. But the warmth of those 2 words carried Vivian through the rest of the day. Until 5:47 p.m., she was packing up her desk when Marcus Chen appeared in her doorway. He looked worse than she'd ever seen him. Tie loosened, sleeves wrinkled, dark circles stamped beneath his eyes like bruises. "We need to talk," he said. "About what?" Marcus stepped inside, closed the door, sat down across from her desk without being invited. "About the fact that you're sleeping with Roman Castellano." Vivian's entire body went rigid. "Excuse me?" "Don't." Marcus held up his hand. "Don't insult me with denial. I'm the one person in this building who actually cares about you, and I'm telling you right now, people are talking. People are always talking. Not like this. Celeste has been making calls, quiet ones, to board members, to investors, to people outside this company who have a vested interest in Roman's operations. She's building a case that you've compromised the new ownership through, her words, inappropriate personal influence." Vivian's stomach dropped. "That's insane." "Is it? You spent the night at his residence 3 days ago. Don't ask me how I know, Sin. It doesn't matter how I know. What matters is that if I know, Celeste knows. And if Celeste knows, she's already using it." Vivian sat down slowly. Her hands were cold. The air in the office felt thinner. "Marcus, whatever you think is happening, I think you're a brilliant marketing executive who's gotten tangled up with a man who operates in a world where mistakes don't get corrected with HR meetings. They get corrected with violence. He's not like that. He's exactly like that. That's not a criticism. It's a fact. Roman Castellano is a dangerous man who does dangerous things, and the fact that he brings you coffee and reviews your pitch decks doesn't change what happens when someone threatens what belongs to him. I don't belong to him." Marcus leaned forward, his voice dropped. "Then what are you doing in his penthouse at 2 in the morning?" Silence. Vivian looked at her friend, this decent, worried, sleep-deprived man who'd spent 6 years watching her back in an industry that rewarded backstabbing, and understood that he wasn't attacking her. He was trying to save her, and that terrified her more than anything Roman's enemies had done. "I don't know what I'm doing," she admitted quietly, "but I'm not going to stop." Marcus stared at her for a long moment. Then he exhaled, the heavy, defeated breath of a man who'd said everything he could and knew it wasn't enough. "Then be careful," he said, "because Celeste Vaughn isn't just gossiping. She's weaponizing. And in Roman's world, weapons don't stay pointed in one direction for long." He stood, walked to the door, paused. "You're the best strategist I've ever worked with, Viv. Don't let this be the campaign that destroys you." Then he was gone. Vivian sat alone in her office as the building emptied around her. The city darkened outside her window. Her phone buzzed, a text from Roman. 2 words. "Dinner tonight?" She stared at the message for a long time. Then she typed back, "Your place. 8. And pressed send before the rational part of her brain could stop her, because Marcus was right about everything, and she was going anyway. That night, standing in Roman's kitchen while he cooked, actually cooked, sleeves rolled to his elbows, a dish towel over one shoulder, moving through his own kitchen with the same quiet authority he brought to boardrooms and criminal negotiations, Vivian told him about Celeste. Roman listened without interrupting. He sliced garlic with a chef's knife, the blade moving in precise rhythmic motions that Vivian tried not to read as metaphorical. When she finished, he set the knife down. "I already know," he said. "You knew Celeste was making calls? I know everything that happens inside my company and outside it. Then why haven't you done anything?" Roman turned to face her. His expression was the kind of calm that came right before storms, because I needed to know how far she'd go before I acted. Now I know. How far? Far enough. Roman, that's not... She contacted the Moretti family. The words hit Vivian like a physical blow. She what? 3 weeks ago. An encrypted call to a number linked to Dominic Moretti's inner circle. 14 minutes, followed by 2 additional calls the following week. She's working with them? She's providing information. About me. About the company. About my daily movements and the people I spend time with. He paused. About you. Vivian's legs felt weak. She gripped the edge of the counter. The fire alarm, she whispered. That was her? She provided the access code. Someone from Moretti's crew entered through the service entrance, triggered the alarm from the 22nd floor, and exited before security could respond. How long have you known? I confirmed it this morning. And you let me walk into that building today. You let me give a presentation. You let me sit in meetings with her 30 feet away while she was feeding information about me to people who want to hurt you? Yes. Why? Roman's eyes held hers. Because I needed her to believe she was still invisible. And I needed the presentation to happen so the board sees your value as a professional before they learn about our personal relationship. The calculation behind it made Vivian's skin crawl. Not because it was wrong, because it was brilliant. Because Roman had been playing 3 moves ahead while she was still trying to understand the board. What happens now? She asked. Now Celeste Vaughn discovers the cost of betraying me. What does that mean? It means you should stay away from the office tomorrow. Roman, what are you going to do? He walked toward her, slowly, the same way he'd approached her in his office, like moving too fast might shatter something fragile between them. I'm going to protect you, he said, the way I should have from the beginning, before I let my own feelings compromise your safety. That's not an answer. It's the only one I can give you without making you complicit in things you shouldn't know about. He stood in front of her now, close enough to touch. His hand came up and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, gentle, careful, at odds with everything his words implied. Do you trust me? He asked. The question was simple. The answer was the most complicated thing Vivian had ever considered, because trusting Roman Castellano meant accepting that the man who touched her face like she was made of something precious was the same man who was about to do something terrible to Celeste Vaughn. It meant understanding that love and violence existed in the same hands, and that the fingers tracing her cheekbone tonight might be signing someone's destruction tomorrow. Yes, she said, and meant it, and hated herself a little for meaning it. Roman kissed her forehead, pulled her against his chest, held her in the dark kitchen of his penthouse while the city burned with light below them. Stay tonight, he murmured against her hair. People will talk. Let them. Marcus already knows. Marcus is loyal. Celeste won't be a problem after tomorrow, and anyone else who has something to say can say it to my face. And if they don't have the courage to say it to your face, his arms tightened around her, then they can say it to the men I send instead. Vivian closed her eyes. She was past the point of no return. She knew it the way you know you've driven too far to turn back, not because the road ended, but because the place you left had already disappeared behind you. There was no version of this that ended safely. No version where she walked away unscathed. Roman Castellano had opened a door into his world, and she'd walked through it with her eyes open and her hands shaking and her heart beating so loud she was sure his security team could hear it through the walls. And somewhere across the city, in a darkened office on the 23rd floor of Blackthorn Media, Celeste Vaughn sat behind her desk, staring at her phone, watching 3 missed calls from a block number light up the screen. She didn't know it yet, but her time had just run out. Celeste Vaughn arrived at Blackthorn Media at 7:42 a.m. wearing a cream blazer and the composed expression of a woman who believed she was still 3 steps ahead. She carried her coffee in a ceramic travel mug, never paper, never plastic, and walked through the lobby with the deliberate pace of someone who wanted to be seen without looking like she wanted to be seen. She didn't notice the 2 men standing near the elevator bank who weren't there yesterday. She didn't notice that the security guard at the front desk, the one who'd worked mornings for 6 years, had been replaced by someone broader, younger, with an earpiece and eyes that tracked her from the door to the elevator without blinking. She didn't notice any of it, and that was her first mistake. The elevator doors opened on the 23rd floor, and Celeste stepped into a hallway that felt wrong. Not visibly. The lights were the same. The carpet was the same. The framed campaign awards lined the walls in their usual arrangement. But the air had changed. The way air changes before a storm breaks or before someone kicks in a door. A thickness. A pressure. The kind of silence that wasn't empty but full of something waiting. Her assistant's desk was cleared. Not messy cleared, stripped. The computer was gone. The phone was gone. The personal photos and the succulent plant named Gerald and the color-coded sticky notes, all gone. The desk surface was bare except for a single manila envelope centered precisely in the middle. Celeste stopped walking. Her coffee mug lowered an inch. Then Roman's voice came from behind her. "Good morning, Celeste." She turned. He was standing at the end of the hallway, framed by the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the Chicago skyline. Two men flanked him, not the usual security. These were different. Older. Harder. Men whose suits didn't quite conceal the architecture of violence beneath them. Roman's hands were in his pockets. His expression was the most terrifying thing Celeste had ever seen. Not because it showed anger, but because it showed nothing. Absolute zero. The emotional temperature of a man who had already made every decision that mattered and was now simply executing the sequence. "Come with me," he said. It wasn't a request. Celeste followed him down the hallway, past her stripped desk, past the darkened offices of colleagues who hadn't arrived yet, or had been told not to, and into the large conference room at the corner of the floor. The room where Vivian had delivered her Meridian presentation 48 hours ago. The conference table had been cleared except for a laptop positioned at the far end, its screen dark. 3 chairs remained. Roman took the one at the head of the table. His 2 men stood behind him, hands clasped in front of them, faces carved from the same granite as the building's foundation. "Sit," Roman said. Celeste sat. She placed her coffee mug on the table with careful precision. Her hands weren't shaking, not yet, but her fingers wrapped around the ceramic with a grip that turned her knuckles pale. "I assume this is about the restructuring," she began, her voice calibrated to project calm authority. "I have some thoughts on the timeline." 3 calls, Roman said. Celeste stopped. "Excuse me?" 3 calls to a number registered to a shell company in Newark. That shell company is owned by a holding group in Trenton. That holding group is controlled by the Moretti family. Roman's voice never changed pitch, never changed speed. It moved through the facts with the mechanical precision of a metronome. The first call lasted 14 minutes, the second 9, the third 22. The color drained from Celeste's face in real time. Vivian would later learn every detail of this moment from a security recording Roman showed her, and even on the grainy footage, the transformation was visible. The way Celeste's practiced composure crumbled from the jawline down, like a building demolishing floor by floor. "I don't know what you're talking about," Celeste said. Roman opened the laptop, turned it to face her. The screen displayed a transcript, dates, times, duration, and beneath each entry blocks of text. Not complete transcripts, but fragments. Enough fragments. Celeste's eyes moved across the screen. Her mouth opened slightly, closed, opened again. "Those aren't your exact words from the second call," Roman interrupted, reading from memory without looking at the screen. "She's nobody. A marketing girl from the South Side he's infatuated with. If you apply pressure to her, he'll lose focus. That's your window." Silence. The kind of silence that exists at the bottom of deep water. Heavy. Total. The kind that makes your ears ring. "A marketing girl from the South Side," Roman repeated. His voice dropped lower, quieter, more dangerous than Celeste had ever heard it. "That's how you describe the woman He stopped himself. Recalibrated. When he continued, the personal had been surgically removed, leaving only the professional. "You provided the access codes for the service entrance on April 14th. You communicated my daily schedule, my security rotation patterns, and the identity of a specific employee to a rival organization. You facilitated a breach of this building's security that could have resulted in physical harm to multiple people." "Roman, listen to me. I'm not finished." Celeste's mouth snapped shut. "You've been with this company for 9 years. In that time, you've built genuine relationships, delivered strong results, and contributed meaningfully to Blackthorn's growth. All of that is true. Roman leaned forward slightly. It's also true that you contacted my enemies, sold private information, and directly endangered someone under my protection because you were jealous. The word landed like a blade. Celeste flinched. That's not... Don't. Roman's voice finally carried an edge. Thin, precise, lethal. Don't tell me it was strategic. Don't tell me you were protecting the company. Don't insult us both by pretending this was anything other than what it was. Celeste's composure shattered completely. Her hands came off the coffee mug and flattened against the table, fingers spread wide like she was trying to hold on to something solid. You changed, she said, and her voice cracked on the second word. You walked into this company, and within 2 weeks you were bringing her coffee, reviewing her work at midnight, looking at her the way you never... She stopped. The silence that followed exposed everything she'd meant to keep hidden. Roman stared at her. For one brief, almost imperceptible moment, something moved behind his eyes. Not sympathy, exactly, but recognition. The recognition of a man who understood what it felt like to want something desperately enough to make catastrophic decisions. Then it was gone. Your access credentials have been revoked, he said. Your company accounts are frozen. Legal will contact you within 48 hours regarding the non-disclosure provisions of your employment agreement and the criminal implications of corporate espionage. Criminal implications? You leaked proprietary business information to a criminal organization, Celeste. That's not a termination issue. That's a federal issue. Her face went white. You wouldn't. I would. And I will, if necessary. Roman stood, buttoned his jacket with one hand. But I'm offering you an alternative. Full cooperation. Every conversation, every exchange, every piece of information you provided to the Moretti family, documented, verified, and delivered to my legal team within 72 hours. And if I cooperate? Then the federal matter goes away. You leave Blackthorn with a severance package and a non-compete clause, and you disappear from my professional life permanently. And personally? Roman looked at her. The mask was back in place. Impenetrable, perfect, terrifying. Personally, Celeste, you stopped existing to me the moment I read that transcript. He walked out of the conference room without looking back. His men followed. The door closed with a soft click that somehow sounded louder than a gunshot. Celeste Vaughn sat alone in the empty room for 11 minutes before she moved. When she finally stood, her coffee had gone cold, and her hands were shaking so badly she left the mug on the table rather than risk dropping it. She collected the envelope from her desk. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a formal separation agreement, already prepared, already dated. She signed it in the elevator on the way down. Vivian learned about Celeste's removal through Marcus, who called her at noon with a voice that sounded like it had been wrung out and hung to dry. She's gone, he said. Security walked her out this morning. The whole floor watched. Vivian was standing in her apartment, the apartment she hadn't slept in for 2 nights. The apartment that now had cameras on the entrances and a panic button beside her bed that connected directly to Roman's security team. She pressed the phone harder against her ear. What happened? Nobody knows the specifics, but Roman called a department heads meeting for 2 o'clock, and the rumor is he's addressing it directly. He told me to stay home today. Yeah, that tracks. Marcus paused, the kind of pause that carried weight. People are connecting dots. You were absent on the same day Celeste was terminated, the same day Roman called an emergency meeting. The optics aren't great. I know. Do you? Because the story writing itself in that building right now isn't Celeste was a corporate spy. It's Celeste was removed because she crossed Roman's girlfriend. The word hit Vivian in the chest. I'm not his girlfriend. Tell that to the 60 people who watched him stare at you during your presentation like you were the only person in the room. Vivian closed her eyes, leaned against her kitchen counter, felt the cool granite against her palms, and tried to ground herself in something solid. What do I do? She asked. Come back tomorrow. Head high. Work your campaign. And for the love of everything, be careful, because the person who was leaking information about you is gone, but the people she was leaking to are still out there. Marcus hung up. Vivian stood in her kitchen for a long time, staring at nothing. Then her phone buzzed. Roman. It's handled. 2 words. No context. No explanation. No acknowledgement that handled in his vocabulary might mean something vastly different than it did in hers. She typed back, "What did you do?" 3 dots appeared. Disappeared. Appeared again. "What I had to." Vivian set her phone on the counter and pressed both hands against her face. She stood like that for a full minute, breathing into her palms, feeling the warmth of her own breath against her skin. Then she lowered her hands and looked at her reflection in the darkened microwave door. The woman looking back at her was someone she barely recognized. Not the Vivian who'd boarded a plane 3 weeks ago, terrified of turbulence and angry about a faceless mafia boss buying her company. That woman had been afraid of clear, simple things: airplanes, power, men who operated outside the law. This Vivian was afraid of something far more complicated. She was afraid that she was becoming someone who could accept what I had to as an answer. And she was afraid that acceptance felt less like surrender and more like understanding. Roman called her at 8 p.m. "Come to the penthouse. We need to talk first." "We'll talk here." "No. I need to say something, and I need to say it without your security team listening and without your hands on me, because when you touch me I can't think straight, and I need to think straight right now." Silence on the line. Then quietly, "Say it. What happens next time?" "What do you mean?" "Celeste is gone." "Fine. But what happens the next time someone threatens me? Or the next time a rival family decides I'm useful leverage? You removed one problem, Roman, but the problem isn't Celeste. The problem is that loving you makes me a permanent target." The word slipped out before she could catch it. Loving, not caring about, not being involved with. Loving. She heard Roman exhale on the other end, a long, slow breath that carried more weight than any word. "You're right," he said. "I know I'm right. The threat doesn't end with Celeste. It doesn't end with the Morettis. As long as you're in my life, you're exposed." "Then what's the plan?" "The plan is that I end the Moretti threat permanently." "What does permanently mean?" "It means I'm going to do something tomorrow night that changes the power structure of this city. And after it's done, nobody will touch you again. Nobody will even speak your name without my permission." "Roman, but I need you to understand something first." His voice was raw in a way she'd never heard. Stripped of control, stripped of calculation. Just a man on the phone in the dark telling the truth to the only person who'd ever demanded it. "After tomorrow, there's no going back, not for me, not for us. The things I'm about to do will make the world see me differently. And if you're standing next to me when that happens, the world will see you differently too." Vivian's throat tightened. "What are you asking of me?" "I'm asking you to decide tonight, before tomorrow changes everything. Because once it starts, I won't be able to stop it, and I won't be able to protect you from the consequences of being mine." The apartment was silent around her. The city hummed outside her windows. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, thin and lonely, cutting through the night. "I already decided," Vivian said. "I decided in your kitchen. I decided when I straightened your tie. I decided on that plane when I grabbed a stranger's arm and told him the truth because I was too scared to lie." "Vivian, I'm not going anywhere, Roman. Not tonight, not tomorrow, not when it gets ugly. You wanted someone who wasn't afraid to be honest with you? Here's honest. I'm terrified. I'm in love with a man whose world could kill me, and I'm staying anyway." The silence on the other end of the line lasted so long, Vivian thought he'd hung up. Then Roman's voice came through, barely above a whisper, broken in a place she didn't know he had. "Then come home." 2 words. And Vivian understood that home didn't mean her apartment with the new security cameras and the panic button by the bed. Home meant him. She grabbed her coat and her keys and walked out into the Chicago night, where a black SUV was already waiting at the curb, engine running, headlights cutting through the dark. She climbed in. The door closed behind her. And across the city, in a warehouse on the south side that officially didn't exist, 12 men sat around a table waiting for Roman Castellano's orders. Orders that would detonate the fragile peace between 2 families and send shockwaves through every criminal network from Chicago to the East Coast. Roman stood at his penthouse window, phone still in his hand, watching the city light shimmer against the black surface of the lake. Tomorrow, he would become something worse than what Vivian had called him on that plane. Tomorrow, he would earn every name she'd given him. And the only thing standing between the man he was tonight and the monster he'd become by morning was the sound of her voice still echoing in his ear, saying the most reckless, most beautiful, most devastating thing anyone had ever said to him. "I'm staying anyway." He closed his eyes and began making the calls that would burn his world to the ground. The calls went out at midnight. Roman made 7 of them from the private office inside his penthouse, a room Vivian had never entered, a room with no windows and a steel-reinforced door that locked from the inside. She sat in the living room, curled into the corner of a leather sofa that probably cost more than her car, listening to the muffled cadence of his voice through the walls. Italian. English. Back to Italian. Each conversation shorter than the last, each one carrying the clipped finality of a man issuing orders he didn't intend to repeat. At 12:47, the door opened. Roman walked out looking like a different person. Not physically. He still wore the dark shirt, sleeves rolled to his forearms, the same watch on his left wrist catching light from the lamp. But something behind his face had shifted, hardened, like wet concrete setting into its final shape. "It starts tomorrow at 6 p.m., he said. Vivian pulled her knees tighter against her chest. "What exactly starts?" "I'm calling a summit, both families. Neutral ground. The Lakeview, a private event space I own through a holding company. The Morettis think it's a negotiation about territory boundaries on the west side." "And what is it actually?" Roman sat down across from her, not beside her, across, like he needed the distance to say what came next. "It's an exposure. Celeste cooperated, gave my legal team everything. Every call, every piece of information she passed, every instruction the Morettis gave her. I have recordings, financial transfers, a paper trail connecting Dominic Moretti directly to the breach of my building." "So you're confronting him." "I'm destroying him, publicly, in front of every underboss, every capo, every connected figure in this city. When tomorrow night is over, the Moretti family will have no allies, no credibility, and no leverage. And if Dominic doesn't take that well," Roman's eyes met hers, "he won't. Then what happens? Then we find out which of us planned better." Vivian stared at him across the dark living room. The city glowed behind him through the windows. Millions of lights belonging to millions of people who would wake up tomorrow and go to work and never know that 2 criminal organizations were about to collide in a private event space overlooking the lake. "You're scared," she said. It wasn't a question. Roman's jaw tightened. For a moment she thought he'd deny it, retreat behind the mask, reassemble the mafia boss who didn't feel fear because fear was a weakness and weakness was death. But he didn't. "Not for me," he said quietly. "For me?" "For what happens to you if I'm wrong about how tomorrow plays out." Vivian uncurled herself from the sofa, stood, walked across the room and sat down beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched, close enough that she could feel the tension vibrating through his body like a plucked wire. "Then don't be wrong," she said. Something cracked in his expression. Not a smile, not relief. Something rawer than both. The look of a man being handed a reason to survive something he'd been preparing to endure alone. He took her hand, held it against his thigh, said nothing. They sat like that until the city went dark and the first gray light of dawn crept through the windows. The next 18 hours moved in fragments. Roman left the penthouse at 6 a.m. surrounded by 4 men Vivian had never seen before. Older, harder, carrying themselves with the quiet efficiency of people who'd done this 100 times. He kissed her forehead at the door, held her face in both hands for 3 seconds, then walked out without looking back. Vivian spent the day in the penthouse with Marco and Enzo stationed outside the front door. She tried to work on the Meridian campaign, opened her laptop, stared at a slide deck that felt like it belonged to a different person's life, closed it, opened it again, read the same sentence 7 times. At 2 p.m., Marcus called. "Something's happening," he said. Roman cleared his entire afternoon schedule. His security doubled at the office. People are whispering. "I can't talk about it." "Viv, whatever's going on." "I said I can't talk about it, Marcus." Silence. "Are you safe?" "Yes." "Are you sure?" "I'm sure." She wasn't sure, but telling Marcus that wouldn't help either of them. At 4:30, a woman arrived at the penthouse carrying a garment bag and a hard-sided case. She introduced herself as Renata, said nothing else, and spent 40 minutes fitting Vivian into a black dress that looked like armor and felt like a second skin. Mr. Castellano wants you at the Lakeview by 6, Renata said, zipping the garment bag closed. He wants me there? He was very specific. Why? Renata looked at her with the patient expression of someone who'd learned long ago not to ask questions she didn't want answered. Because tonight, everyone needs to see you standing beside him. Vivian understood. This wasn't a date. This wasn't Roman wanting her close because he loved her. This was strategy. If Roman was going to publicly dismantle the Moretti family, he needed the world to see that the woman they'd targeted, the weakness they'd tried to exploit, was untouchable, present, protected. His. She was the message. The Lakeview sat on a private stretch of shoreline north of the city, a converted estate with floor-to-ceiling windows, Italian marble, and the kind of understated luxury that whispered instead of shouted. Vivian arrived at 5:50 in a black SUV flanked by 2 others. The driveway was lined with vehicles, Mercedes, BMWs, one Bentley that looked like it had been driven straight off a showroom floor. Inside, the main hall was already filling. Vivian recognized none of the faces, but she recognized the energy. These were people accustomed to power, the way they stood, the way they held their drinks, the way their eyes tracked every entrance and exit with unconscious precision. Men in dark suits speaking in low voices. Women positioned strategically beside them, beautiful and watchful. Roman was standing near the far wall, flanked by his 2 senior men. He wore a suit so dark it absorbed light. Black on black, the shirt buttoned to the collar, no tie. When Vivian entered, his eyes found her immediately. He crossed the room. Every pair of eyes in the hall tracked his movement. The conversations didn't stop, but they thinned, softened. People noticed. Roman stopped in front of her, took her hand, raised it to his mouth, and pressed his lips against her knuckles. A gesture so deliberate and public it might as well have been a press release. "You look like you're about to go to war," Vivian murmured. "I am." "Then why do I feel like the one wearing armor?" His thumb traced across her knuckles. "Because you are the armor." He led her to a position near the front of the hall. Not hidden, not displayed, but present, visible. A chair had been placed for her at a slight angle to the main table, close enough to hear everything but positioned so she wasn't part of the negotiation. She was the audience, the evidence, the living proof of what the Morettis had tried to weaponize and failed. At 6:15, Dominic Moretti arrived. He was shorter than Vivian expected, compact, built like a man who'd spent decades compressing his ambition into a body that couldn't quite contain it. His hair was silver, slicked back, and his face carried the leathery permanence of someone who'd survived things that should have killed him. He wore a charcoal suit and a watch that cost more than some houses, and he walked into the Lakeview with the confidence of a man who believed he was attending a routine territorial negotiation. 4 of his men followed. They positioned themselves along the wall like mirror images of Roman security. Same posture, same cold eyes, same barely concealed readiness. Dominic's gaze swept the room, landed on Vivian, held for 2 seconds, then moved to Roman. "Castellano." He extended his hand with the practiced ease of a man who'd shaken hands with enemies 1,000 times. Roman took it, brief, firm. "Dominic. Interesting venue, private. Privacy suits what I have to say." They sat across from each other at the main table. The room arranged itself around them, underbosses, advisors, connected figures who operated in the gray space between both families. Perhaps 30 people total. Every one of them carrying the same tension in their shoulders, the same awareness that something tonight was different. Roman began simply. 3 months ago, I acquired Blackthorn Media Group as a legitimate business operation. Standard acquisition. Clean paperwork. No territorial implications. Dominic nodded, sipped his drink. Attentive but relaxed. Within 6 weeks of that acquisition, Roman continued, someone began feeding information about my operations, my schedule, my security protocols, the identities of key employees, to an outside party. The room shifted, barely perceptible, a collective inhale. Dominic's expression didn't change. Corporate espionage. Unfortunate, but common. The outside party was your organization, Dominic. Now the room stopped breathing entirely. Dominic set his glass down. Slowly. The crystal touched the table without a sound. That's a serious accusation. It's not an accusation. Roman reached into his jacket pocket and produced a phone, set it on the table between them. It's a fact. He pressed play. Celeste Vaughn's voice filled the room, crisp and clear, recorded with a quality that left no room for dispute. Her words to the Moretti contact played out in the devastating silence, schedules, access codes, Vivian's name and address, descriptions of Roman's daily movements. Every syllable a nail in a coffin Dominic didn't yet realize he was lying in. The recording played for 4 minutes and 12 seconds. When it ended, Roman picked up the phone and set it back in his pocket with the unhurried calm of a man putting away a loaded weapon he didn't need anymore. Your people recruited my employee, Roman said, used her to breach my building's security, used the information she provided to identify and target a civilian under my protection. His eyes locked onto Dominic's. A civilian, Dominic, not an associate, not a soldier, a woman who works in marketing and had nothing to do with our world until your people made her a target. Dominic's composure held, barely. His fingers pressed flat against the table. His jaw shifted. The muscles in his neck pulled tight. I don't know anything about that, he said. You authorized those calls. The financial transfers from your holding company to the intermediary who handled Celeste Vaughn came from an account that requires your personal authorization. I have the records. Would you like to see them? I'm telling you, I didn't. You're lying to me in front of every person in this room. The words landed like a detonation. Not loud. Roman never raised his voice, but the impact was physical. People shifted in their seats. Hands moved beneath tables. The air pressure in the room seemed to change. Dominic's face darkened. The mask of diplomacy crumbled, and beneath it was something uglier, the cornered fury of a man who'd been outmaneuvered and knew it. Be very careful, Roman, Dominic said. You're young, you're powerful, but you don't get to sit across from me and call me a liar in my own city. This isn't your city anymore. The silence that followed was absolute. Roman stood, slowly, the way a man stands when he wants every eye in the room to track the movement. Effective tonight, every business arrangement between the Castellano family and the Moretti organization is terminated. Every shared territory reverts to my control. Every joint operation is dissolved. Dominic shot to his feet. His chair scraped against the marble floor with a shriek that cut through the silence. You can't do that. I just did. You're starting a war. No. You started a war when you targeted someone I love. The word detonated through the room. Love. Roman Castellano had just used the word love in front of 30 people who operated in a world where love was leverage and leverage was death. Every head in the room turned toward Vivian. She felt their eyes like heat, 30 pairs of them, evaluating, calculating, reassessing everything they thought they knew about the man standing at the head of the table. Vivian met their stares. She didn't flinch, didn't look away, didn't reach for the armrest or the glass of water beside her. She sat in that chair wearing the black dress that felt like armor and looked directly at Dominic Moretti with the steady gaze of a woman who'd spent her entire life being underestimated and was finished with it. Dominic's eyes narrowed on her. Contempt? Disbelief. The particular fury of a man who couldn't comprehend that a woman from the South Side could matter enough to cost him an empire. You're destroying a 50-year alliance over a girl, Dominic spat. I'm destroying a 50-year alliance because you broke it, Roman replied. The girl is just the reason I'm not giving you a second chance. Dominic's hand moved toward his jacket. The room froze. Roman's men shifted. Subtle, practiced, hands dropping to their sides with the fluid precision of people reaching for weapons they'd drawn 1,000 times before. Dominic's men mirrored them. For 5 seconds, the Lakeview existed on the edge of a knife. 30 people. 2 factions. Every person in the room calculating angles and exits and the probability of surviving the next 10 seconds. Then Dominic's hand stopped. His fingers hovered near his lapel. His eyes locked onto Roman's. This isn't over, Dominic said. Yes, it is. You just don't know it yet. Dominic turned, walked toward the exit. His men fell in behind him. Tight formation, eyes sweeping the room, hands still positioned near concealed weapons. At the door, Dominic stopped, turned back. His eyes found Vivian one last time. You should have stayed on the plane, sweetheart, he said. Roman moved before anyone else in the room could react. Not toward Dominic, toward Vivian. He stepped between her and the door, placing his body directly in the line of sight, his back to Dominic, his face toward her. The message was clear: you address her, you go through me. Dominic laughed, a short, bitter sound. Then he walked out into the night, and the door closed behind him, and the room exhaled like a body surfacing from deep water. The aftermath moved fast. Roman's men secured the exits within 30 seconds. Phone calls went out, rapid, coded, in at least 3 languages. The remaining guests were escorted out in small groups, each departure managed with the choreographed precision of an evacuation drill. Vivian stayed in her chair. She watched Roman work, watched him transform from the man who'd kissed her knuckles an hour ago into the general commanding a war he'd just declared. He moved between his men with quick, decisive energy, issuing orders, reviewing security feeds on a tablet one of his people handed him, making calls that lasted 15 seconds each. At 7:45, the room was empty except for Roman, Vivian, and the 2 senior men who never seemed to leave his side. Roman turned to her. "We need to move. Now." "Where?" "Not the penthouse. They'll be watching the penthouse." "Then where?" "I have a secondary location, off the books. No connection to any property records under my name." "Roman, what did you just do?" He crossed to her, took her hands, pulled her to her feet, held her face the way he had at the penthouse door that morning. Both hands, gentle pressure, his thumbs against her cheekbones. "I chose you," he said. "In front of every person who matters in this world, I chose you. And now I need to make sure that choice doesn't get you killed." His phone buzzed. He glanced at it. His expression changed, a tightening around the eyes, a slight parting of the lips. The look of a man reading something he'd feared but expected. "What is it?" Vivian asked. Roman looked at her, and for the first time since she'd known him, since the plane, since the conference room, since the first time he'd touched her face, she saw genuine, unmasked fear in his eyes. "Moretti moved faster than I expected," he said. "His men just hit 2 of my locations on the west side, simultaneously." "Casualties?" "Unknown." "Roman, and there's a vehicle that's been sitting outside your apartment building for the last 40 minutes. Engine running, 4 occupants." Vivian's blood turned to ice. "My apartment? You're not there. They don't know where you are. That's our only advantage right now." He gripped her hand, pulled her toward the service exit at the back of the hall. His men moved in formation, one ahead, one behind, weapons drawn, earpieces crackling with urgent Italian. They hit the cold night air. The SUVs were waiting, engines running, headlights off. Roman opened the door and guided Vivian inside. His hand stayed on the small of her back, pressing firmly. Not guiding anymore. Shielding. He climbed in beside her. The convoy moved. No lights. The vehicles cut through side streets Vivian didn't recognize, moving fast, making turns that seemed random, but clearly weren't. Roman was on the phone. His voice was hard, controlled. But underneath the control, Vivian could hear something she'd never heard before. The sound of a man calculating whether the thing he'd done to protect the woman he loved had just put her in more danger than she'd ever been. "How many at the West Side locations?" he asked. A pause. His jaw clenched. "Secure the families first. Everyone else is secondary." Another pause. "I don't care about the buildings. Buildings can be rebuilt. People can't." He hung up, looked at Vivian. In the darkness of the moving vehicle, his face was all shadows and sharp edges, the architecture of a man who'd been built by violence and was now watching it come for the one thing he'd tried to keep separate from it. "I need you to listen to me," he said, carefully. "I'm listening. The next 48 hours are going to be the most dangerous of my life, and by extension, the most dangerous of yours." "I understand." "No, you don't. Not yet." He took her hand, squeezed it hard enough that she could feel his pulse through his fingertips. Rapid, hammering, betraying every ounce of calm his voice was fighting to maintain. Dominic Moretti isn't going to stop at property. He's going to escalate. He's going to push until one of us breaks. "Then don't break." Roman's eyes locked onto hers in the darkness. "The only thing that could break me right now is losing you." The SUV turned sharply. Headlights swept through the rear window. Another vehicle, close, too close. Roman's hand went to his waist, His security man in the front passenger seat spoke rapidly into his earpiece. "It's ours," the man said after a moment. "Third vehicle running back up." Roman's hand came off the weapon, but it didn't stop shaking. They arrived at a building Vivian had never seen, a converted industrial space in a neighborhood she didn't recognize, surrounded by vacant lots and chain-link fencing. Inside, it was surprisingly clean, functional, a safe house built for exactly this purpose: beds, supplies, communications equipment, steel-reinforced doors and windows. Roman walked her inside, checked every room, positioned his men, then stood in the middle of the main room and looked at her with an expression that held everything he'd been holding back for hours: the fear, the fury, the devastating tenderness of a man who'd just declared war on another family to protect a woman he'd met on an airplane. "I need to go," he said. "Go where?" "To handle this. To respond. To end it before it escalates further." "Roman, you can't." "I can. And I have to. Tonight." He stepped closer. "But I need to know you're here, safe, behind reinforced doors with armed men who would take a bullet before they let anyone through that entrance." Vivian grabbed the front of his shirt, pulled him close, kissed him hard, not tender, not romantic, but desperate. The kiss of a woman sending a man into something she wasn't sure he'd come back from. When she pulled away, his forehead rested against hers. "Come back," she whispered. "I will. Promise me." His hands tightened on her waist. "I promise." Then Roman Castellano walked out into the Chicago night, flanked by men carrying weapons and loyalty in equal measure, heading toward a confrontation that would either cement his empire or bury it. And Vivian stood in the doorway of a safe house she didn't know existed 12 hours ago, watching the taillights disappear into the darkness, her hands still shaking, her lips still burning, and the terrifying understanding settling into her bones that the man she loved was driving toward something that could take him from her permanently. She pressed her back against the steel door, closed her eyes, and waited for the sound of either his voice or a phone call that would end everything. The call came at 3:17 a.m. Vivian was sitting on the floor of the safe house with her back against the steel door, knees pulled to her chest, her phone gripped in both hands so tightly the screen had fogged with the heat from her palms. She hadn't moved in 4 hours, hadn't eaten, hadn't slept. The two guards stationed inside the main room had stopped trying to talk to her around midnight. They sat across from each other at a small table, playing cards in silence, their weapons resting on the surface between the dealt hands like centerpieces. When the phone rang, Vivian answered before the first vibration finished. "Roman," his voice came through rough. Lower than usual, scraped raw around the edges like someone had taken sandpaper to it. "It's done." 2 words. The same 2 words he'd texted after Celeste's removal, but these carried a different weight, heavier, darker, soaked in something Vivian couldn't name and wasn't sure she wanted to. "Are you hurt?" A pause, too long. "Roman, are you hurt?" "Nothing that won't heal. That's not a no." "It's the answer I'm giving you right now." Vivian pressed her free hand against the steel door behind her, feeling the cold metal against her palm, grounding herself. "What happened?" "I'll tell you in person. I'm 20 minutes out." "Tell me now." "Vivian, tell me now, or I'm going to spend the next 20 minutes imagining the worst thing possible, and my imagination is very good." She heard something on the other end that might have been a laugh if it hadn't sounded so exhausted. "The West Side operations are secure. The men who hit them have been dealt with. Dominic's infrastructure in the city is dismantled. His supply routes, his distribution network, his financial channels. All of it. He has nothing left to operate with inside Chicago. And Dominic himself? Alive. Contained. Being escorted out of the state by people who will make sure he understands the terms of his departure." "What terms?" "The kind that don't require a contract because breaking them would be the last thing he ever did." Vivian closed her eyes. She pressed the phone harder against her ear, listening for something beneath his words. Pain, regret, the sound of a man becoming something he couldn't come back from. But all she heard was exhaustion. Deep, bone level, the kind that came from spending hours operating at maximum capacity with no margin for error. "Are your people okay?" she asked. Another pause, this one different, weighted with something she recognized as grief. Luca took a round in the shoulder. He's at the hospital, one of ours, off the books. He'll recover. Anyone else? Bruises, cuts, nothing permanent. Nothing permanent on the outside. Roman was quiet for a moment. No, he said. Not on the outside. The line went silent. Then she heard the sound of a car engine, the muffled voices of his men, the click of a seatbelt. 20 minutes, he said. I'll be here. He arrived in 18. Vivian heard the vehicles before she saw them, the low rumble of multiple engines cutting through the pre-dawn silence. She stood up from the floor, her legs stiff, her dress wrinkled beyond saving. The guards moved to the door with practiced efficiency, one checking the security feed on a tablet mounted to the wall, the other positioning himself at the reinforced entrance with his hand near his weapon. It's him, the first guard confirmed. The door opened. Cold air hit Vivian's face. Then Roman walked in, and she understood immediately why he'd avoided telling her whether he was hurt. His suit jacket was gone. His shirt, the same black shirt he'd worn to the summit, was torn at the left sleeve, the fabric darkened with something that looked like dried blood, but might have been someone else's. A cut ran along his right cheekbone, shallow but raw, already starting to swell. His knuckles were split on both hands, the kind of damage that came from hitting something hard, repeatedly, without concern for the bones underneath. But his eyes were the worst part, not because they were angry or cold or frightened, because they were empty, drained. The eyes of a man who'd spent the last 6 hours doing things that required him to shut off every part of himself that was capable of feeling, and now he was standing in front of the one person who made him feel everything. Vivian crossed the room. She took his face in her hands, carefully, her thumbs avoiding the cut on his cheekbone, and looked directly into those emptied-out eyes. "You're here," she said. "I'm here. You came back. I promised." She kissed him. Not the desperate, urgent kiss she'd given him before he left. Something softer, slower. The kind of kiss meant to remind a person that they were still human after hours of being something else. Roman's hands came up to her wrists. He held them there, her hands on his face, his hands on her wrists, and for a moment he just stood, breathing her in, letting the warmth of her palms seep through the numbness. Then his forehead dropped against hers. "I need to clean up," he said. "You need a hospital. It's superficial. Your knuckles are split open, Roman. I've had worse." "That doesn't make this okay." He pulled back enough to look at her. A ghost of something moved behind his eyes. Not a smile, but the memory of one. The faintest echo of the man who'd bought her whiskey on a turbulent flight and let her call him a monster without flinching. "Nothing about this is okay," he said, "but it's over." Vivian led him to the small bathroom at the back of the safe house. She found a first aid kit under the sink, military grade, stocked with supplies she hoped she'd never need to identify. She cleaned his knuckles with antiseptic while he sat on the edge of the bathtub, his injured hands resting in hers, his eyes following her movements with the unfocused attention of a man running on empty. He flinched once when the antiseptic hit a deep split on his left hand. Vivian paused, looked at him. He nodded for her to continue. "The Morettis," she said, wrapping gauze around his right hand. "Are they really gone?" "From Chicago. Dominic still has operations in Jersey, Connecticut, parts of New York. But his influence here is finished. The people who mattered, the ones who provided him access, protection, credibility, they all watched him get exposed tonight. Nobody will work with him in this city again." "Because of what he did to your operations?" "Because of what he did to you." Vivian's hand stilled on the gauze. "People in my world understand violence," Roman continued. "They expect it. Rival families hit each other's operations. That's the cost of doing business. But targeting a civilian? Using a woman who had nothing to do with any of this as leverage?" He shook his head slowly. "That crosses a line that even the people in that room tonight won't forgive. Dominic didn't just lose territory. He lost respect. And in my world, you can rebuild territory. You can't rebuild respect." Vivian finished wrapping his hands, set them gently on his knees, looked at him. "And the respect you gained tonight? By publicly declaring you love me in front of every criminal figure in Chicago? What about it? You told me mafia bosses aren't supposed to love anything enough to become vulnerable. You said that on the phone. Those were your words. They were. So what changed? Roman looked at his bandaged hands, turned them over slowly, studied them like they belonged to someone else. I spent 30 years building a life where vulnerability was the most dangerous thing I could show. My father taught me that. His father taught him. You protect yourself by being untouchable, by never giving anyone something they can use against you. He looked up at her. And then a terrified woman on an airplane grabbed my arm and told me I was a soulless predator, and I realized the most dangerous thing wasn't vulnerability. What was it? Living your entire life without anyone brave enough to tell you the truth. The safe house was silent around them. The guards had retreated to the main room. The first light of dawn was starting to press against the frosted bathroom window, turning the glass from black to gray. I made a choice tonight, Roman said. I chose you in front of everyone. And that choice cost me something. Alliances, protection, the perception of invulnerability that kept certain threats at bay. Those are real costs. I won't pretend they're not. Do you regret it? He reached out, took her hand, pulled her closer until she was standing between his knees, his bandaged hands resting on her hips. I regret every year I spent before that plane, he said. Every year I spent being untouchable. Every year I spent surrounded by people who were too afraid of me to be real. His grip tightened slightly. I don't regret tonight. I don't regret the summit. I don't regret a single word I said in that room. And I don't regret the things I did after Dominic walked out, even though they were the kind of things that would make the woman I love look at me differently if she knew the details. I'm not asking for details. I know. That's what scares me. Why? Because it means you've already accepted what I am. And accepting what I am means you've changed too, Vivian. Not into something bad, but into someone who can stand in a room full of killers and not flinch. That takes something from you, something you don't get back. Vivian looked at this man, battered, exhausted, sitting on the edge of a bathtub in a safe house at 5 a.m. with gauze wrapped around his broken hands, and felt the full weight of what he was saying. He wasn't just talking about her physical safety. He was talking about the person she was becoming. The version of herself that could clean blood off a mafia boss's knuckles and feel not horror, but tenderness. Maybe I didn't lose anything, she said. Maybe I just found out what was already there. Roman pulled her down to him, wrapped his arms around her waist, buried his face against her stomach, and held on with the exhausted desperation of a man who'd spent the night fighting a war and was only now in this small bathroom with this woman's hands in his hair, allowing himself to feel the aftermath. His shoulders shook once, twice, then stilled. Vivian held him until the dawn filled the window. 6 months later, Vivian stood beneath the stage lights of the National Marketing Excellence Awards at the Palmer House in downtown Chicago, accepting the industry's highest honor for the Meridian campaign that had transformed Blackthorn Media into a billion-dollar company. The ballroom was packed. Industry leaders, media executives, journalists, photographers, the kind of crowd that measured success in quarterly earnings and market share and couldn't know, that the woman at the podium had spent the last 6 months navigating a world where success was measured in survival. The campaign had been brilliant. Even Vivian could admit that without false modesty. She'd taken every lesson Roman had taught her, about power, about perception, about the difference between telling people what they wanted to hear and showing them something they couldn't look away from, and channeled it into work that didn't just sell a product. It told a story about ambition, about transformation, about what happened when someone stopped being afraid of being seen. The irony wasn't lost on her. She gave her acceptance speech without notes, thanked her team, thanked Marcus, who was sitting at a table near the front looking proud and relieved and only slightly less exhausted than he had 6 months ago. Thanked the Blackthorn staff who'd stayed through the transition and proved that great work could survive great upheaval. She didn't mention Roman by name. She didn't need to. He was sitting in this front row wearing a suit that probably cost more than the award itself, his posture relaxed, his expression carrying the specific kind of pride that he reserved for moments when Vivian exceeded expectations he'd already set impossibly high. His hands, healed now, though faint scars still traced his knuckles, rested on his knees. His dark eyes never left her face. When she returned to her seat, he leaned close. "You forgot to mention the part where you called me a monster on an airplane," he murmured. "I'm saving that for the memoir. I'll have my lawyers review the manuscript." "I'd expect nothing less," That night, Roman hosted a private celebration at the Lakeview, the same venue where 6 months earlier he'd dismantled the Moretti Empire and declared his love for a woman the entire criminal underworld had been warned never to touch. The space had been transformed. Warm light, music, tables set with the understated elegance that Roman brought to everything when he wasn't using it as a battlefield. 50 people, close colleagues, trusted associates. The handful of individuals who existed in the overlap between Roman's two worlds, the legitimate and the other, and who understood that tonight was about celebrating both. Marcus was there, 3 drinks in, telling a story about the time Vivian had accidentally sent a client presentation to the entire company instead of the creative team. Beth, the copywriter, was there, no longer chewing her nails, laughing louder than anyone in the room. Even Renata, the silent woman who delivered the black dress that night, was there, nursing a glass of wine in the corner and almost smiling. At 10 p.m., Roman stood. The room quieted immediately. Not with fear, not anymore, with respect. The kind that was earned, not extracted. The kind that came from watching a man burn down the walls around himself and build something different with the wreckage. He walked directly to Vivian. 6 months ago, he said, his voice carrying across the silent room, a woman I'd known for approximately 2 hours told me that power is what you build when nobody's afraid to tell you the truth. Vivian's heart started hammering. She also called me a bloodthirsty tyrant, a soulless predator, and a monster hiding behind expensive suits. Nervous laughter scattered through the crowd. She said all of this while clutching my arm so hard she left bruises, during severe turbulence. On a flight she almost missed because she was running through O'Hare in heels. More laughter, warmer now. Vivian covered her face with one hand, her cheeks burning. I've spent my entire life surrounded by people who tell me what I want to hear, Roman continued. People who calculate every word, who measure every reaction, who treat honesty as a liability because in my world, it usually is. His voice softened. And then this woman, terrified, furious, completely unaware of who she was talking to, gave me the most honest 2 hours of my life. And I've spent every day since trying to deserve that honesty. He reached into his jacket pocket. The room went still. Roman lowered himself to one knee. Vivian's hands dropped from her face. Her eyes went wide. Her breath caught in a way that reminded her violently of that plane. The same loss of equilibrium, the same feeling of the ground disappearing beneath her feet, except this time there was no terror. Just freefall. Roman opened a small velvet box. Inside, a diamond caught the light and scattered it across the walls like a private constellation. You crashed into my life during a thunderstorm, he said, and his voice, the voice that had commanded rooms, issued orders, made powerful men fall silent, cracked on the last word, just slightly. Just enough for everyone in the room to hear the human underneath the empire. And you somehow became the only peace I've ever known. Vivian's vision blurred with tears. Marry me, Vivian. She looked at him. At this man on his knee in front of 50 people, his scarred hands holding a ring, his dark eyes stripped of every defense he'd ever built. She looked at the cut on his cheekbone that had healed into a faint white line, at the knuckles that still carried the evidence of the night he'd fought a war for her, at the man who'd let a stranger on a plane call him a monster, and responded by falling in love with her honesty. Yes, she said. The word came out broken and laughing and crying all at once. The sound of a woman who'd spent her whole life being strong, finally allowing herself the luxury of being overwhelmed. Roman slid the ring onto her finger, stood, pulled her against him, and kissed her in front of every person in the room, a kiss that was equal parts promise and apology, and the specific kind of tenderness that only exists between two people who've survived something that should have destroyed them. The ballroom erupted. Marcus was on his feet, applauding with the relieved enthusiasm of a man who'd worried about this exact outcome for months, and was now grudgingly admitting it might have been the right one. Beth was crying. Even the stone-faced security men positioned along the walls allowed themselves the smallest of smiles. They married 3 months later, not in a cathedral, not in a ballroom. On the shore of Lake Michigan, on a strip of private beach Roman owned but had never used, beneath a sky that started gray and broke into gold as the ceremony began, as if the city itself had decided to cooperate. Vivian wore white, not the architectural structured kind of white that belonged in magazine spreads, but something softer, flowing. The kind of dress a woman wore when she wanted to feel like herself instead of a version of herself built for someone else's approval. Roman wore black, because of course he did. The ceremony was small, 30 people, no press, no spectacle. Just the people who mattered standing on sand that was still damp from the morning tide, watching two people who had no business belonging to each other choose each other anyway. Marcus stood as Vivian's witness. He'd argued against this relationship for months, had lost sleep over it, had told Vivian twice, directly, without softening, that she was making the biggest mistake of her life. And then he'd watched her become the strongest, most focused, most fearlessly honest version of herself he'd ever known. And he'd shut up about it. Standing beside her now, holding the ring, he looked like a man who'd been proven wrong in the best possible way and was grateful for it. During her vows, Vivian held Roman's hands, those scarred, bandaged, rebuilt hands, and smiled through tears. "I spent 2 hours insulting the love of my life on an airplane," she said, and the small crowd laughed softly. "I told him he was a monster, a predator, a tyrant. I said every terrible thing I could think of while gripping his arm for dear life because I was too scared to let go." She squeezed his hands. And he listened. He didn't defend himself. He didn't argue. He didn't walk away. He bought me a whiskey and asked me real questions and let me use him as an anchor through the worst turbulence of my life. Her voice steadied. "That's who you are, Roman. Not the man the world sees. Not the empire. Not the fear. You're the man who sits quietly next to a terrified stranger and lets her hold on. That's the man I fell in love with. That's the man I'm marrying today. And that's the man I'll keep being honest with, even when it scares us both for the rest of my life." Roman's jaw worked. His eyes were bright. Not with tears exactly, but with something close. Something he was fighting to control and losing. When he spoke, his voice was rougher than she'd ever heard it. "I've built empires," he said. "Destroyed rivals. Survived things that should have killed me a dozen times over. And the bravest thing I've ever done was let a woman on a plane tell me exactly who I was and choose to become someone different because of it." He raised her hands to his mouth, pressed his lips against her knuckles the way he had at the summit, deliberate, public, declaring something that words couldn't fully carry. "You didn't just change my life, Vivian. You saved it. And I will spend every day of whatever time I have making sure you never regret grabbing a stranger's arm during a thunderstorm." They kissed on the shore of Lake Michigan while the sky burned gold above them and the small crowd applauded and the waves pulled at the sand beneath their feet. Years later, their daughter would discover the story by accident, overhearing Marcus at a dinner party, retelling it with the embellishments of a man who'd been dining out on the narrative for the better part of a decade. She would demand the full version, then their son would demand it too. And eventually it became the story their children asked for the way other children asked for fairy tales. At bedtime, during car rides, whenever the world felt too big or too frightening. "Tell us about the airplane. Tell us about the turbulence. Tell us about how Mom called Dad a monster and he fell in love with her anyway." And Vivian would tell it every time, editing the dangerous parts, softening the edges, turning a story about fear and power and survival into something that sounded almost like a fairy tale, if fairy tales were set in Chicago and involved criminal empires and first-class turbulence. And every time they boarded a plane together, which was often, because Roman Castellanos still traveled frequently and had long since stopped traveling without his wife, he would wait until the seatbelt sign illuminated and the engines roared and the wheels left the ground. Then he would lean close and whisper, with that same dangerous almost smile she'd first seen at 30,000 feet. "So, any new terrible things you'd like to say about me today?" And Vivian would laugh and take his hand and press her shoulder against his arm the way she'd done that very first night. Not because she was afraid anymore, but because some anchors once found you never let go of. The plane would climb, the city would shrink beneath them, and somewhere between takeoff and landing, between the life she'd imagined and the one she'd chosen, Vivian Mercer Castellano would close her eyes and feel the specific kind of peace that only exists when you've survived the storm and discovered that the most terrifying thing in the sky was never the turbulence. It was how badly you wanted to land safely beside the person next to you. And she always did.